So, after over 4 years of publication and over 3 years since I've caught up with the manga, One Piece's Wano arc is finally entering its final stages. It's not over yet. I plan to do an in-depth analysis live when that time comes, but with what has happened in the most recent chapters, I can't see a way for there to be anything that could possibly happen that could affect this video. And so it's time to do this, which is ranking all the One Piece arcs from worst to best. This is entirely subjective, though I will be weighing them heavily based on how well they achieve the thing that they are trying to achieve and whether or not I think that achievement was worth reading through. And I should also preface this with the fact that there are no outright bad arcs in One Piece. It's usually pretty solid. It's one of those manga that its consistency is one of its greatest strengths. It's very rarely out of this world great, and it's very, very rarely actually bad. It's solid and it's almost perfect in how solid it is, even though it's kind of a jack of all trades. It's very much greater than the sum of its parts. So with that out of the way, number 31 is Long Ring, Long Land. This is Oda's ode to Wacky Races. And Wacky Races is a show that I'm not super fond of in general. It's one of my least favorite Hanna-Barbera shows, and so I wasn't super fond of Oda taking over 20 chapters, I think, so somewhere in that ballpark, that paying homage to Wacky Races. And this is the arc that is the most skippable. As of yet, nothing in this arc has really come into play. It does introduce Aokiji, but that leads more into the arc that follows than it does this arc itself. It's just not super great at achieving what it set out to do. I respect people's opinion that this deserves to be higher, like even top 10, because it is a generally well thought out, well executed homage to Wacky Races. It's just not something I was ever going to like. And there's not really any way I can think of that would make this arc better in hindsight. Number 30 is Syrup Village. This is the arc that introduces Usopp, who is arguably my least favorite Straw Hat. Obvious thing you have to point out with a ranking list is that something has to be at the bottom. I love all the Straw Hats. Someone's got to be at the bottom. It's probably Usopp. I do enjoy all of these arcs. Something's got to be at the bottom. It's probably Long Ring, Long Land, followed by Syrup Village. Early One Piece was trying a little too hard to be like Dragon Ball, and as good of a writer as Eiichiro Oda is, he's not the same kind of writer as Akira Toriyama. Akira Toriyama is a gag mangaka god, basically, whereas Oda's skill set lies completely elsewhere. Yes, One Piece in general is pretty comedic. It's not the funniest. I don't even think it's the funniest of the big three. I think the gags in Bleach, which are few and far between, and the gags in Naruto sometimes are funnier than the gags in One Piece. That's my opinion, but the biggest issue I have with Syrup Village is the villain. I find Captain Kuro to be very lame. I never really saw him as a threat. It makes rereading this arc drag even more than it would on a first time read when you don't really know what's going to happen. And the whole theme with the Black Cat Pirates is a big letdown compared to what came directly before this and the next two arcs that came after this. Number 29 is Drum Island. This is the arc that introduced Chopper, who is also not my favorite Straw Hat, though he's like in the middle of the pack, I would say. He's really good for what he is. Again, biggest problem with this arc is the villain. This is by far the lamest villain Luffy and the Straw Hats have ever come up against, and it goes on way too long. It does not need to be this long. This is the first arc in the series that I was reading when I actually first sat down to read this. This was the first one that I was like, this is going on way too long. This needs to be like 10 chapters shorter. And a lot of that was due to the villain. Another minor personal grievance of mine is that I'm not a fan of snow settings. I'm not a fan of desert settings in general. And yes, polar stuff is technically a desert because they technically don't get a whole lot of rain. So snow settings and sand settings are typically two of my least favorite settings for fantasy. And in a black and white manga especially, I kind of get bored of snow settings. So with that said, of course, number 28 is going to be the other snow setting of One Piece, and that's Punk Hazard. Punk Hazard gets a leg up on the bottom three by having cool villains. Not threatening villains, especially in hindsight. Punk Hazard reads a little bit differently when you know that Luffy had Gear 4th the entire time and never bothered to use it because he thought he didn't need it. The setting is what really drives me up the wall with this. It's an island that is half volcano and half frozen tundra, and they somehow spend most of the arc in this gray, bland laboratory. This also has a lot of pacing issues. It's another arc that goes on way longer than it needs to. A lot of that is contributed to the villain, who is kind of underwhelming in the physical department, but Caesar Clown is a lot of fun, and he's got a really terrifying power that would make him basically impossible to beat without hockey. And that's kind of what ends up doing him in, is that this is post-time skip. This is the first post-time skip arc I'm talking about today. Luffy and the crew are a lot stronger now than they were in prior arcs, which is why the villains kind of come off as lame, despite being the strongest villains Luffy had actually taken down at that point. Another thing that puts it above the rank and file is Law's breaking the gear speech. I think that's top 5 moments in all of One Piece. Number 27 is Reverie. This is a mini arc that was sandwiched in between Whole Cake Island and Wano, 2 of the 3 longest arcs. And this was basically just a recap of what is going on in the world as Luffy heads to Wano. And on that front, it's fine. The revelations are genuinely meaningful, I think. Not a single goddamn thing in this arc has actually really come to fruition yet. That has everything to do with how long Wano has been going on for. So I put it right here at the bottom. Not a bland or not a struggle to get through the way that Punk Hazard, Drum Island, and Syrup Village are. It's really mercifully short. Yeah, there's just not really anything there yet. This could maybe go higher as the series goes on. Speaking of getting higher as the series goes on, number 26 is Fishman Island. Another arc with a very bland villain who I didn't care for. Stakes that were kept relatively low compared to what had come before and what follows. And went on for way too long. What separates this from Punk Hazard, though, is that a lot of that extra time is spent on world building, and One Piece's world building is generally really, really good. And the setting is also one of the most creative and cool looking settings in all of One Piece. That's why it's as high as it is, but Hody Jones is my second least favorite villain of the entire series. It would go at the very bottom would be Wapol from Drum Island, and then Hody Jones, and then right above him would be Captain Kuro. You'll probably notice that my fondness of the villains will increase as I get higher and higher on this list. It's something that I think is very important for a show that is based around action. And it's something that One Piece struggles with more than almost any other aspect of its storytelling. Number 25 is Amazon Lily. I appreciate this arc for being much more lighthearted, despite being in between some very heavy subject matter, and dealing with some heavy subject matter on its own terms as well. Biggest problem with this arc is that as much as I like Boa Hancock when she's with Luffy, there's a lot of Boa Hancock without Luffy in this arc. More so than any other arc that has featured Boa Hancock. And like I've said numerous times before, I don't like Boa Hancock when she's not interacting with Luffy. And so that's kind of what's dragging this down. As well as the setting, which is pretty creative as far as its placement and stuff. It kind of gives me the same vibes as parts of Sky Island. Number 24 is Postannies Lobby. I hesitate to call this an arc, but I am going off of the official arc listings, so I have to separate this from what it is actually concluding, and this is actually the resolution to the Water 7 arc, and it is a fine resolution. It has some absolute bomb reveals, but it's maybe a little too much too quickly, which is why it is, Reverie kind of had this problem too, where it was too much too fast. Like, it probably would have benefited from the revelations being spread out across an entire arc where other things are going on. But with how stacked Water 7 and Enies Lobby were, I can kind of see why they would save all the revelations and stuff for after Enies Lobby and just bomb after bomb after bomb after bomb. And they're really good reveals and really important for the world building of One Piece, but once you already know what those revelations are, then you kind of skip this entire section of the manga if you're going to reread it. Like, there's nothing else really there to make it worth reading over again. Number 23 is Orangetown. This is kind of the benchmark, the all-time gatekeeper for One Piece arcs. If you are above Orangetown, I really like you, and I'm not going to really have much to say negatively about you. If you're below Orangetown, it's because you got some serious problems. Orangetown is like the default One Piece arc, I think. Crew shows up to an island. Island is dealing with the problem. Problem happens to be a clown-based pirate at this point. And then the hijinks ensue. It's pretty funny. The gags are actually kind of on point in this arc, much more than other early One Piece arcs. And it's just a lot of fun, and it's all tied together with a very compelling theme that is pretty unique to this series, and one that just keeps getting piled on top of. The whole theme of treasure and what people treasure and what they're willing to do for that treasure is kind of at the core of One Piece. It's why Oda decided to have a manga based on pirates. This is a very relevant topic for them. Like I've already indicated, Buggy is great, and his crew, as much of a gimmick as they are, it's at least an interesting gimmick, much more than Black Cats or even... Would you even count Don Krieg's pirate crew as having a gimmick? I kind of would, but I'll get to that when we get to Bratier. Number 22 is The Return to Sabaodi. This is catharsis. It's another in-between arc. It's the first arc post-time skip, and it's trying to ease you in to readjusting to the Straw Hat crew dynamic, because it had been over 2 years of publication since the Straw Hats had been together. And it's really good for what it is. The only thing I can think of to complain about is that it's so good at doing its meager job that it makes Fishman Island and Punk Hazard even worse off, because I've heard the argument that Fishman Island is supposed to show off the Straw Hats post-time skip and what they're capable of doing. But Return to Sabaodi, which was right before Fishman Island, already did that. And it also didn't because Gear Forth is a thing Luffy learned or came up with during the time skip and doesn't break out until Dressrosa. And that happens a lot. Like, just a little anecdote about Wano. Robin gets a fight in Wano, and she has a flashback of like some training she did post time skip. It had not come up until that moment in Wano because Return to Sabaodi and the arcs that followed didn't actually showcase all the Straw Hats and what they had learned. At least not anymore, now that we know that Robin and the others had other tricks up their sleeve that they didn't break out until much, much later. Number 21 is Reverse Mountain. There's not really much to say about this arc except that it spiked up like 5 places on my ranking when, well, hold on, because at one point I had Reverse Mountain at the bottom as I was reading it, and so it jumped up a couple places, however many places it's jumped up, after Thriller Bark. This is a very necessary arc because it explains how the Grand Line works and what you need to do to progress through the Grand Line. And in doing so, it explains why no one had found the One Piece yet, even if by sheer dumb luck. The One Piece is something that you are not going to ever be able to find through dumb luck. You have to go through the Grand Line and go through it the way that the Grand Line is meant to be gone through. Other than that, like, it's fun. It introduces characters. It introduces Vivi, kinda. And it's solid for what it does. It's just what it does is not very special. Number 20 is Jaya, which is a setup arc, which I haven't really had a chance to talk about yet. Setup arcs kind of set up a much bigger, more relevant arc. And Jaya does, I think, a very good job, better than most setup arcs in most series. Thing holding it down, I never cared about Bellamy. Not caring about Bellamy, even after Dressrosa, keeps this arc down. But what I do care about is Blackbeard, and Blackbeard is also officially introduced in this arc, and his introduction is fantastic. It's why this arc is as high as it is. Number 19 is the post-war arc, also known as the flashback arc. I think it's called like ASL or something, but I don't like that name. I get A for Ace, S for Sabo, and L for Luffy, but I just call it the post-war arc or the flashback arc. I think this was, in the grand scheme of One Piece, a very dangerous move by Oda, yet one that absolutely works because Oda is a fucking genius. It kind of puts in perspective that we had yet to see Luffy's actual backstory. We saw his backstory with Shanks and how he got the hat, but that's it. And it puts in perspective that everything we love about Luffy has to do with the kind of person Luffy is in the present, not feigned sympathy for his backstory. Most writers rely on backstory to earn sympathy points. Oda does still with his villains, but with his heroes, he introduces them, he shows them off, and it took like 8 to 10 years. I'm not quite sure what year this post-war arc was being published, but it wasn't until the post-war arc that we really saw Luffy, Ace, and were introduced to Sabo as kids, saw what they had gone through, saw the kind of upbringing that they actually had, and why Luffy and Ace become the kind of people that they are. And it just hits like a truck coming right off the heels of Marineford, and this is why I think it was very dangerous. Because at this point in the story, Ace is already dead. So Oda was trying to make us feel retroactively sad about Ace's death, even though the only reason to be sad about Ace's death is because we care about Luffy, and Luffy cares about Ace's death. At least that's my reading, because kind of getting into a little bit of my history with the series, my first interaction with Ace ever, by any extent, was a top 10 anime death list. I had watched the 4Kids version of One Piece when I was younger. I had somehow missed all the episodes with Ace. I did not know Ace existed until I watched that top 10 anime deaths video. And so, when he was introduced in Alabasta, the only thing I knew was that he was Luffy's brother and that he was gonna die. And I knew how he was going to die too, because I had seen it. That robbed a lot of the emotion from Marineford for me. And it's why Marineford is not going to be at the top of this list. Little spoiler alert. Marineford is not going to be at the top of this list, as it is on a lot of people, because that initial emotional catharsis was basically robbed from me by happenstance. And the post-war arc does not do enough to make me care about Ace again, and neither do any of the arcs that have followed since. I just don't really care about Ace. I care about him because I love Luffy, and Luffy loves Ace. That's the extent of it. Getting on to number 18, it's Skypia, the arc that is one of the more divisive arcs. This is another arc that I think goes on a little too long, and I love the sky stuff. I love how Oda creatively uses the fact that this is a black and white manga to emphasize things. It's very Bleach, actually. Of the quote-unquote big three, I think Bleach has the best art. And Skypia is the one that reminds me the most of Bleach because of how well it uses its black and white space. Nell is a decent enough villain, very powerful, very intimidating, and very flippant. He's a very enjoyable antagonist, not anywhere near my favorite, but he's heads and shoulders above a lot of the antagonists that had come before him, which is good for something that happens, this is the third major saga of the series. And the world building and lore we get is also really good. Again, the main drawback to this arc is that it goes on a little too long. I can't really think of any other complaints. Maybe with the last, third of this arc going into the jungle part of Skypia with God's Land, or whatever they call it, and it is just kind of a generic Mesoamerican style jungle, which, granted, we don't really see a whole lot of that in manga or anime. I've seen a lot of it because, I live in America, where that's just part of our history, Be much more unique for Japanese readers to be exposed to that. Carrying on, number 17 is Thriller Bark. This arc has the best art in the entire series. It kind of reminds me of Bleach with how it uses its black space as well as its white space to emphasize certain objects and motions. Other than that, Gecko Morio is kind of a letdown of a villain. He's another warlord. He's the second warlord we had fought, and he's nowhere near as cool as Crocodile, let alone Mihawk. I love Me the Macabre. I love this style. I love this aesthetic. This kind of goth, cheery but gloomy style or setting. What's keeping this down is that is Absalom and Sanji's role in this arc. I never really disliked Sanji. I'm not someone who outright dislikes pervy humor. In fact, I've indulged in pervy humor plenty of times. Thriller Bark crossed the line for me into being very uncomfortable, and it's actually an arc that this doesn't happen very often. The anime does it better. The anime does the humor a lot better than the manga in this arc. They actually, edited some dialogue and stuff to make Sanji less of a scumbag creep, which is much appreciated It actually knocked Sanji down several points on my Straw Hat ranking when those moments happened. Number 16 is the arc that came directly after Thriller Bark, which was Sabaodi. This is actually kind of my case-perfect study of what I was talking about with postannies lobby and reverie, where it's those arcs were so short that was too much too quickly. Sabaodi is also short, but it's significantly longer than those arcs, and it benefits from it because each big bombshell is actually given the space to breathe and be a plot point and actually have relevancy to what's going on and compound on itself and contribute to the overall plot as well as the plot of this saga that it's introducing, because this is also setting up the Summit War saga even more so than Thriller Bark was. And this arc does not shy away from some heavy material, and that is very much appreciated in a series that oftentimes runs into juvenile humor for the better. I like its humor overall. Again, it's not my favorite, but I like it. But yeah, Sabaodi is one of those arcs that I actually reread and rewatch a lot more than a couple of the arcs that are above it. Just because I think what it does, it doesn't do super perfectly, but what it does is just so important for the story as a whole. Luffy needed an L, and this is the arc that handed him the biggest, fattest L I think I have seen in any shonen story. Maybe it's been surpassed since then. Maybe with some of the recent My Hero Academia stuff, it's been surpassed. But other than that, Sabaodi is kind of unrivaled in taking a character and his friends at the height of their power, seemingly, and just tearing them apart. Number 15 is a lot simpler. It's Little Garden, the first of a couple jungle set islands. This arc has dinosaurs. That's why it's number 15. I'm a simple man. I'm very easy to entertain, very hard to impress, and when you tickle my fancy or pander directly to me, I'm going to lap that up heavily. I love me Vikings. I love me dinosaurs. I love me volcano jungle islands. And I love me writers proving me wrong about characters. This is Usopp's finest hour. This is the arc that actually made me like Usopp. Before this arc, I loved Nami, I loved Luffy, I loved Zoro, in that order. I liked Sanji just fine. I hated Usopp. I hated Usopp when he was first introduced in Syrup Village. This is the arc that made me like him. And I hear a lot of people say that too. He really is that good in this arc. And he does get that kind of development in this arc. And it's very much appreciated. It makes the Straw Hat Crew a 10 out of 10 team, which is something you need when that team then goes on for another 800, 900 chapters since Little Garden. Jesus. Number 14 is the very first arc in the show, Romance Dawn, which is not an island, but it's kind of a collection of little things that happen to help you get into the story. Introduces Luffy, introduces Kobe, introduces the pirates, introduces the Marines, introduces Zoro, introduces the fact that this is a very morally gray world despite being a very cartoony world at the same time. Pretty unique among action shows. And it's just really good at what it does. Again, it's very short, very sweet, and very important. It's kind of perfect for what it is, but the emotional heights of this arc are shallow because not a lot actually happens, especially compared to arcs that I have in my top 10. Number 13 is Whiskey Peak. I don't see this arc getting anywhere near the amount of praise it should. The entire sequence of Zoro just being a badass is peak One Piece for me. This is also the only arc that actually makes their bounties plot relevant, in that it has bounty hunters who are trying to cash in on Luffy's 30 million berry bounty. And this is the arc that introduces the Alabasta plot in full. Reverse Mountain was technically the first arc in the Alabasta saga, and it did introduce Vivi, sorta. I said that when we were talking about Reverse Mountain. This is the arc that actually reveals that this random bounty hunter side character is actually the Princess of Alabasta, who has infiltrated Baroque Works in an attempt to bring them down and save her kingdom from destruction. I love that. I love this setting. I like, I complained about desert settings earlier. The giant cacti that are actually mountains littered with gravestones is fantastic. It's one of those things that I had never thought of before, and I can't get it out of my head all these years later. Speaking of things I can't get out of my head years later, number 12 is Log Town, or Rogue Town. The town of beginning and the town of ends. This is the island where Goldie Roger was born, and it's the island where he was executed, and this is the arc that brings Buggy back into the fold and turns him into the very first reoccurring character. And it also introduces Smoker, who is one of my favorite characters. At least top 10, maybe top 5 favorite characters. And certainly my favorite Marine character. And this is another kind of like setup arc / epilogue arc, which is just really clever with the log town, because it's like a travel log, but it's also a prologue to Alabasta and an epilogue for East Blue all at the same time. And it also introduces Dragon hundreds of chapters before we find out what that even means. It's just one of those arcs that's really cool to read as you're going through it for the first time. It's decent, it's well paced, it's well drawn, but it just keeps getting better every time I revisit it. Number 11, just missing out of my top 10, is Impeldown. The only thing keeping this arc out of the top 10 is that it is totally all over the place. This arc is supposed to be hell for pirates. This is the underwater prison ran by the world government. Luffy is infiltrating it to find his brother Ace and rescue him, and it distracts from the heavy drama and tragedy and brutality with some of the lamest, most juvenile poop jokes in the entire manga, as well as like BDSM jokes and just all sorts of just gags that really have no business being in the saga. Like, even more than Amazon Lily, which was much more comedic, but that whole arc was kind of built around its comedic aspects, whereas this is built around, like, how horrible of a place Impeldown is, and then you have goofy nonsense. That's the only reason why it didn't make my top 10. I love this arc. I love how it really showcased Luffy as a lead, even more so than Amazon Lily. It brought characters like Crocodile, Buggy, and Bon Clay back into the fold. How Bon Clay is just the realest of real ones. I love the introduction of Jinbei. I love Blackbeard just showing up and causing all sorts of chaos. Magellan is a very terrifying villain, even if he spends like 20 hours a day on the toilet because poop jokes. This is One Piece kind of at the height of its powers. This whole saga is, I believe, still the best-selling saga in One Piece, and it's actually what made it the best-selling manga of all time, a throne that it has sat on ever since. But there's just arcs that I think are a lot more emotionally cathartic and a lot more complete in their own right. A lot of arcs, because One Piece is such a well put together story overall, a lot of individual arcs suffer from spending a lot of time setting up things that happen way later Impeldown, no exception. There's just a lot of arcs that I think are better self-contained as well as being parts of the greater whole. You gotta kind of have both to crack my top 10. Number 10 is Dressrosa, an arc that is way too fucking long. Other than it being just really long, really indulgent, and just Oda leaning into some of his absolute worst habits as a writer, this is a really good arc. I love how many characters are introduced. I love how much of a balancing act it does. What keeps it from being higher is that it's off balance a lot of times when it comes to the Straw Hats. It writes like half of them out of the arc a third of the way through, has them go on to the next saga without Luffy and the rest. And then it sidelines Nico Robin. And it loses a lot of points. It loses a few amount of points for that, but that few amount of points is the difference between the number 10 spot and the number 5 spot. Because after like the number 8 spot, it's kind of anyone's game. Number 9 is Zoe. This is kind of the exception to my rule for cracking my top 10, and that this is not a complete arc by itself. It does what Logtown did, and it does it even better than Logtown did it, and the setting is by far my favorite setting in the entire show. Zoe is my favorite island, hands down. I love Zunisha, I love the furries, or the minks rather. And I love how perfectly executed this is as both an epilogue to the Dressrosa saga by tying in Caesar Clown's poison gas with everything and catching up with the Straw Hats that left Dressrosa a third of the way through that arc, while also being a setup for Whole Cake Island with the Sanji subplot, and a setup for Wano with Jack the Drought in the role he plays in it, and the whole Raizo is safe moment. Raizo is safe being another thing that would probably crack my top 5 favorite One Piece moments. It pulls this quadruple duty of being a setup, a payoff, a setup for something that happens way later, and being world building, and having its own kind of unique identity as this arc of Luffy exploring this island, meeting its inhabitants, and forming this large alliance to take down the emperors. And the fact that it does this in like 25 chapters just blows me away, especially compared to pretty much every other post-time skip arc. Like, I don't have the chapter numbers right in front of me, but going off the top of my head, I'm pretty sure like Fishman Island was 50 chapters, Punk Hazard was 50 chapters, Dressrosa was over 100 chapters, Whole Cake Island was like 70 to 80 chapters, and Wano's been going on for over 140 chapters at this point. Yet Zoe is only 25 chapters and manages to accomplish just as much as any of those other arcs, possibly even more than some of those arcs. And speaking of those arcs, number 8 is Whole Cake Island, which when I did my initial run of reviews for One Piece, I said this was my favorite post-time skip arc. You'll notice that there is one post-time skip arc I have not mentioned yet. We'll get there. Whole Cake Island is, in my mind, I almost separated it into 3 different arcs, because you kind of have the stuff that leads into the fight with Cracker, and then Luffy versus Charlotte Cracker kind of concludes the first act, and then you have all the stuff leading up to Luffy joining an alliance with Gang Beige. It's kind of like the Act 2, and then Act 3 is just chaos. Everything is just happening all at once. Big Mom's on a rampage, Jinbei's joining the crew, Pedro sacrificing himself, Luffy versus Katakuri. Luffy versus Katakuri is still the best fight in the manga, and probably the best fight that got animated as well. Katakuri is awesome. He is what puts this arc over the top for me. Otherwise, it'd be a notch or two below Dressrosa and maybe even like Impeldown and Logtown, and it'd be like Whiskey Peak rank if not for how awesome Katakuri is and how I like the Candyland aesthetic of Whole Cake Island. It's a unique identity as far as One Piece islands go, and that's something I kind of look for, especially as we get further and further in the Grand Line. Number 7 is the climax of pre-time skip One Piece, which is Marineford. I already said my main drawback to Marineford earlier, which is that I was not invested in the conflict because I didn't really care about Ace. Other than that, this is just page spread after page spread of highly detailed action. And that's another thing, that it's perfect for what it is, but not perfect for what I look for in a perfect arc. Which is a concept that I struggle with grasping all the time. And I think I speak on behalf of a lot of critics when every critic has personal preferences and gotta set those aside, but not too far aside that we become robotic. Whitebeard is awesome. I could do an entire 10-minute long video just talking about Mihawk and the role he plays in this arc and what it all means to the wider story of One Piece. And I love Luffy and his little motley crew that he has going on here. And this really is a murderer's row of just big name pirates and big name marines and big name warlords. And it's just fantastic. The other drawback, which is actually kind of the same drawback, but a different angle of that drawback, is that a lot of these characters were introduced in this arc. Even a lot of the ones that were introduced in the saga or had barely been seen. Like Doflamingo had barely been seen at this point. Boa Hancock was introduced 2 arcs earlier in Amazon Lily. That was the first time we had seen her. Jinbei was introduced in Impeldown. Whitebeard we had seen for the first time, I think, right after Alabasta. And then we saw him again after Innie's Lobby. But those were the only 2 times we had ever seen him or any of his crewmates. Same thing with Mihawk, is a character that had been introduced way earlier, but he had only been seen 2 or 3 times since then. The Admirals. Aokiji's the only Admiral that we had any real connection to at this point. Kizaru had only been introduced in the Sabaodi arc, and Aki Inu had been mentioned in Innie's Lobby, but not outright shown until this arc. And so it's a lot harder to get invested in this conflict when you're not really invested in any of the characters, aside from Luffy, who really has no business being there. It's kind of why he gets his ass kicked a lot. Luffy would have been fine had he actually stayed back and supported the rank and file Whitebeard pirates and fought all the nameless marines and helped out with that. But because he kept on trying to be the one to save Ace, because he kept overextending himself, pushing beyond his limits, that's why he kept getting his ass kicked. I think that's fantastic storytelling, and that's also what leads into Whitebeard's role in this arc, and Mihawk's role in this arc, and Shanks' role in the entire story, and how he shows up here, and Kobe and Garp and their dynamic, and it's fantastic. Not my favorite, though. Number 6 is Bratier, the first truly great arc of One Piece, and one that I still think is almost perfect. If I have a gripe, I might have to think about it for a while, because it might not even be a gripe. Don Krieg isn't the best villain. He's better than Kuro, and I like that he, kind of like Buggy, thought that all he needed was a lot of pirates under his command and a lot of really powerful weapons, and that was going to be enough to conquer the Grand Line, only to get his shit absolutely wrecked by Mihawk less than a week after entering the Grand Line. And I like how it sets up the horrors of the Grand Line, and then as Luffy just beats his ass, it shows that Luffy isn't going to be this failed warrior of the Grand Line the way Don Krieg was. Now, he's ready for that level of combat already. Kind of a fun observation I've made in recent months is that Luffy only has 2 points where he got exponentially stronger. After Sky Island, or after Long Ring Long Land, where he started developing the gear system, and then post time skip, or during the time skip, he got exponentially stronger, and then he's gotten a lot stronger since being on Wano. Those are the only 3 times he's had a noticeable increase in power. So this Luffy that absolutely beats Don Krieg's ass is very much the same Luffy who fights Crocodile about 100 chapters later. And this is also the arc that introduces Sanji, of course, and after the most recent chapter of One Piece, I might actually have to have this a little higher. Because the connection that Luffy and Sanji have has recently hit a new height. To the point where Sanji is really trying to climb up the Straw Hat rankings, despite not really being in the last couple chapters, but just finding out what Luffy's actual dream is. It's very much in the same vein as Sanji's entire personality, and I can really see why Luffy was dead set on having him on his crew now. It goes a lot deeper than just, hey, you're a good cook, I need a good cook, come join me. Speaking of some heavy subject matter, number 5 is Enies Lobby, the climax of the Water 7 saga, and what a lot of people consider peak One Piece. I can't think of a real legitimate complaint except that some of the fights weren't super great. Other than that, it's all perfect. Nico Robin's I Wanna Live moment is another contender for top 5 moments in One Piece. And Luffy versus Rob Lucci is the second or maybe third now best fight in the entire series. Top 5 easily. Had to kind of compare this to Water 7, and I'll get to that when I get to Water 7. Number 4 is Alabasta. This is kind of a defining moment in One Piece in that it's something that felt so important and so heavy and so like, oh man, how could they possibly top this in the moment? But since then, Alabasta is like really quaint. Something that Alabasta and Enies Lobby both do right that only one other arc that I haven't gotten to yet does is give every Straw Hat a moment to shine. It gives everyone a fight. Usopp and Chopper versus Mr. 4 and Miss Christmas. Then you have Sanji versus Bon Clay, Zoro versus Mr. 1, Nami versus Miss Double Finger. And then Vivi gets a moment to shine by being the one that actually stops the bomb, or stops like the automatic trigger on the bomb, and then Pell sacrifices himself but then survives anyway. And then of course Luffy versus Crocodile. This is also the arc that introduced Ace. It brought Smoker back. That's all good. I love Crocodile as an antagonist. He's not the most interesting or compelling villain, but he is a good gatekeeper for the Grand Line. I love what he says as he guts Luffy the first time, where he's like, superstar rookie is like you are a dime a dozen. You come in every year, but then you all just get stomped. And in hindsight, Crocodile was speaking from experience, because he was probably one of those young upstart rookies when he started off, and then he got in a tussle with Whitebeard and got fucked up and never entered the New World again, or didn't enter the New World until the time skip. I also love the creativity in this fight. Devil Fruit powers have kind of fallen by the wayside in latter-day One Piece, and this is kind of peak Devil Fruit fight for me, because it's Luffy using his rubber body to come up with a way to fight against a guy who is made out of sand. And it's very creative with how it does things. Now, number 3 is Water 7, the arc itself. The reason why I have this above Enies Lobby and not even right next to or attached to Enies Lobby, despite it mostly being a setup for Enies Lobby, or rather Enies Lobby was the climax of the saga, I think Water 7 does a much better job at being that setup and being that intricately woven machine of characters than Enies Lobby is a series of action scenes. Water 7 is just better at what it does, and what it does, I think, is a lot harder than having action scenes. Water 7 has a lot of characters, a lot of them introduced, a lot of them returning, and it gives them all something to do, and it all compounds, and it's all just very intricately and perfectly put together and executed. The only reason why it's not number 1 is because it didn't really bring high levels of emotion out of me. It brought a lot more than a lot of other arcs, But the top 2 arcs are ones that, for lack of a better word, brought tears to my eyes. Number 2 is Arlong Park. Arlong Park is a perfect story. There is not a single bad thing I could say about it. In hindsight, like Alabasta, it's super quaint nowadays. The Straw Hat Crew was very small at this time, but this is a story about a man who liberates a woman from a very horrible situation that she's found herself in. It is cathartic. It is emotionally heavy. It is dynamic with the way it uses all of its characters. A lot of the town in Arlong Park is more developed than most of the other settings in this series, or any series for that matter. And Arlong is such a despicable, evil villain, and the Marine in this arc is possibly even worse, that every single punch that Luffy throws hits like a tank. You, much like Luffy, don't care that Luffy takes hits too. He lets himself get hit. He does, and it makes it very clear as the series goes on that he takes a lot of blows he doesn't need to, because 1, he's kind of a dumbass, and 2, because it gives him openings. Like that scene where he is in Nami's room and he's just holding the blood-soaked pen that Arlong made her use to draw up all his charts, while Arlong is like preparing to swing at him, and Luffy just gives absolutely no fucks about what Arlong is doing. He is just that fuming mad that this guy would dare use someone like that. Like, the anger in his voice. And this comes across in the manga, but it really comes across in the anime, which is how I first experienced the story. It's one of the best moments in this entire series, and it's not even the best moment in this arc. Luffy putting the straw hat on Nami, his treasure, and he takes his treasure, the thing he values most, the thing he fought Buggy over, the thing that was kind of the linchpin in the Orangetown arc, he gives it to Nami for safekeeping and tells her that everything's going to be okay and that he's going to go beat some ass. That is One Piece for me. Luffy is a hero of liberation, the likes of which no other story has. And that's why I love One Piece so much. Number 1 is Wano, which takes that idea, as well as the ideas put forth in Water 7 and Alabasta and Enies Lobby and Bratier and Marineford and Whole Cake Island and Zoe and Dressrosa and Impeldown, and every arc that has come before this moment. It takes all those ideas and improves them. I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he did it 20 plus years into publishing. Wano is not perfect all the time. It's got more flaws than a lot of the other stuff that made my top 10. But the fact that it actually warrants its length, unlike Dressrosa. The fact that it, just for an example, Alabasta, a lot of the conflict, a lot of Luffy's anger in that arc stems from Crocodile taking people's water away. That's what wrecks the country. That's what starts the Civil War. That's at the heart of that storyline. Kaido is taking away people's food and their freedom. That has the exact same effect, but it's heightened even more because of how much food means to Luffy and how much it means to his crew. And you have, again, I'll have a full live breakdown of Wano at a later date when that arc is actually over. There is no way that this arc drops down in the ranking for me. It's too good at what it does, and it's too much of a compilation of everything that makes One Piece so fucking good. Everything. It has one of the best villains. It has one of the best, most fleshed out settings. It has tons of characters. Every single one of them. And there is dozens and dozens, probably over 100 major characters in this arc. Every single one of them have a very important and vital role to play in this arc, whether it be thematically, action-wise, plot-wise, world-building-wise, or a combination of those factors. And it does this with a lot of new characters, and it gives every single Straw Hat, which there are 10 of now, every single Straw Hat major plot relevance, which hasn't happened since Enies Lobby and Water 7. Every single hand is on deck for this. All the Straw Hats, all their allies, rival pirate crews with the Kid Pirates, the Big Mom Pirates, and the Heart Pirates, all playing their own part in this big, elaborate Rube Goldberg machine of an arc that then somehow sticks the landing when it comes to the final clash between Luffy and Kaido. This high is why I am recording this video and why I sound the way I do, because this arc is so good, it's mind-boggling. I can barely comprehend how good this arc is. I thought Arlong Park would never be topped. Wano proved me wrong, and it proved me wrong several months ago, actually. I've been sitting on this ranking, as it stands, for a while now, just waiting to see how Luffy vs. Kaido shapes up. And not only did it not disappoint, it surpassed my expectations. Oda is just built different. And that's why Wano is number one, and I look forward to talking about it more with you guys at a later date. But until then, how would you rank all the arcs in One Piece? Or what's your top... I'll be merciful and say, what's your top 5? You can give me a top 10 or even a top 30 if you feel so inclined. But I want to know. I want to hear your guys' opinions as well. Comment below, let me know. I'm Mediocrity4. Thanks for watching.